I hung up and immediately began packing the negatives and prints. I needed to get them out of the cabin. If Tanner came back with a search warrant, or without one, they'd be the first things he'd look for. As I worked, a floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, expecting to see Tanner or his deputy. Instead, it was Mrs. Winters, standing in the doorway I'd left unlocked in my panic. "How did you get here?" I demanded. "I walked through the woods," she said, breathless. "I had to warn you. The sheriff called a town meeting after you left the store. He's telling everyone you're delusional, dangerous, that your breakdown has made you a threat." "He's covering his tracks," I said. "He killed Margaret Holloway." Mrs. Winters nodded. "We all suspected, but no one could prove it, and anyone who asked questions found themselves in trouble. Margaret was the only one who ever stood up to him." "I have proof," I told her, retrieving the negatives. "My uncle took photographs of the murder." Her eyes widened. "Your uncle? Parker never owned a camera that I knew of." A chill ran through me. "Then whose film was in his cabin?" Before she could answer, headlights swept across the windows. "That's them," Mrs. Winters whispered, terror in her voice. "They're coming for you." I had seconds to decide. If Tanner found the negatives, they'd disappear forever. If I ran, he'd hunt me down, claim I attacked him, died resisting arrest. But if I could get the evidence to someone outside his reach... I thrust the envelope containing the negatives and prints into Mrs. Winters' hands. "Get these to Doris Matthews at the New York Times. Here's her number." I scribbled it on the envelope. "Tell her everything." Mrs. Winters nodded, then slipped out the back door into the darkness of the woods just as pounding began on the front door. "Sullivan, open up! This is Sheriff Tanner." I took a deep breath and opened the door. Tanner stood there, flanked by Deputy Williams and two other men I didn't recognize. "James Sullivan," Tanner said formally. "I'm placing you under protective custody. Dr. Levinson called, concerned you might harm yourself." "That's a lie," I said calmly. "Dr. Levinson wouldn't discuss my case with you." Tanner's smile was cold. "We'll sort it all out at the station. Come quietly now." I considered running, but knew I wouldn't make it far. Instead, I stepped forward, allowing them to escort me to the waiting cruiser. As they drove me away from the cabin, I looked back, hoping Mrs. Winters had made it safely into the woods with the evidence. The protective custody turned out to be a cell in the town jail. No phone call, no lawyer. Just Tanner's assurance that the doctor will be here tomorrow to take you back to the city. I spent that night pacing the small cell, wondering if Mrs. Winters had made it out of Whispering Pines with the negatives, if she'd called Doris, if anyone would believe the story, even with the photographs. Morning came, and with it, visitors. Not Dr. Levinson, but Howard from the Millfield Gazette and a state police detective named Morales. "Mr. Sullivan," Detective Morales said, "we'd like to ask you about some photographs." Relief flooded through me. "Mrs. Winters got to you." Howard nodded. "She came to the paper last night, said you'd found evidence of a murder." Over the next hour, I told them everything. Finding the film, developing the images, the connections to Margaret Holloway and the Jane Doe case. Tanner sat in the corner, his face a mask of contained fury. "These are serious allegations," Morales said when I finished. "Sheriff Tanner, do you have any response?" Tanner stood, straightening his uniform. "Sullivan's been under psychiatric care. Paranoid delusions. That film could show anything or nothing, and Parker never owned a camera." "Then where did the film come from?" I challenged. "That's the question, isn't it?" Howard interjected. "Because, according to Mrs. Winters, Parker did have a camera. One he borrowed from his nephew, you, during your last visit in 1951. I stared at him. "I've never been to Whispering Pines before now." Howard looked confused. "That's not what Parker told everyone. He said his nephew, the photographer was visiting, showed him how to use a camera." "I don't have an Uncle Parker," I said slowly. "The cabin belonged to my Uncle James. James Sullivan." The silence that followed was deafening. Tanner had gone pale. "There was no Parker?" Morales asked. "Then who?" "Check the property records," I suggested. "See who really owned that cabin." They did. The cabin had indeed belonged to James Sullivan, who died in 1954. He had purchased it from its previous owner, Edward Parker, in 1952. Parker had moved away from Whispering Pines shortly after Margaret Holloway's disappearance. No one had seen him since. The negatives proved to be the key. The state crime lab matched fingerprints on the film canister to Edward Parker, a man who, it turned out, had changed his name and moved to Canada. When Canadian authorities located him, he broke down and confessed. He had witnessed Sheriff Tanner murder Margaret Holloway by the lake after she rejected him one final time. Parker had photographed the crime, intending to report it, but lost his nerve when he realized how much power Tanner wielded in the county. Instead, he sold his cabin to my Uncle James and fled, leaving behind the undeveloped film as either an oversight or perhaps a subconscious plea for someone else to finish what he couldn't. The Jane Doe from Watson County was eventually identified as Margaret Holloway through dental records. Sheriff Tanner and his friend former Sheriff Renfield were both charged with murder and obstruction of justice. I never returned to the cabin after that. I went back to New York, back to my cameras and my job at the Times. The breakdown that had sent me to Whispering Pines faded against the larger purpose I'd found in bringing justice to Margaret Holloway. Sometimes I think about the strange coincidence that led me there, that of all the places I could have gone to recover, I chose the very cabin where evidence of a murder had been hidden for years. Was it coincidence? Or was it something else? My Uncle James leaving me the cabin in his will, perhaps knowing what I might find there. I don't believe in fate, but I do believe in justice. And sometimes, justice needs a witness. Someone to develop the negative, to bring the truth into the light. Sometimes, that's all any of us can do.